Hello and welcome to episode 16 of this Inspire 2020 Visionary Leader Chat Series. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ed Andrew. Ed, how are you?
Very well indeed, thank you, Simon, and a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to be talking to you. So you operate through your own identity, Ed Andrew. You bring humanity to careers and life. You're a transformational coach. You've worked in dozens of countries with thousands of leaders. You're host of the Human Impact podcast, author of The Golden Ticket to Your Dream Job. So you've done a lot of things. And we've spoken a couple of months ago, and I know you've been through your own journey of enlightenment and awareness, which I think really equips somebody in your position to maximize the growth journey of others. So maybe if you could just talk for a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, about your background, your life, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, and just before I do that, I just want to preface that. So you used, Simon, the word enlightenment, and I was talking yesterday I was listening back to a podcast I was just editing of Mark Victor Hansen and Crystal Hansen. So yeah. For those who don't know Mark, he's the co-author of Chicken Soup for the Soul. It's had 59 consecutive #1 bestsellers, sold 500 million books. Okay, yeah. This is fairly well known with Jack Canfield. Yeah. And we were talking about this transcendent journey that people go on when they move through this transformational experience. And some people rise with it as you're learning, and they leave lots of people behind, and their ego rises with it, right? Yeah. Because they feel that they're superior as they move through.
Yeah.
And we were talking to this with Mark and Crystal, his wife, and Mark was saying, well, don't forget that Buddha said, on the day you're enlightened, go and carry water and chop wood. And the day after you're enlightened, go and carry water and chop wood. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So we have to remain level-headed. It's the enlightenment or superiority doesn't exist, because if the ego does, it trashes the journey they're on. But
absolutely.
And I know you understand that, and I'm sure some of your audience, but I think it's very important as people go through transformation journeys, myself included, to recognize that all it is a personal transformation, is that we are learning and growing, and sometimes we can accelerate our learning, but there's always a time to come back and reflect on that. And my own journey really, in some respects, was quite late in life, in that I was well into my 20s before I recognized that there was probably something more magnificent than just a human species on this planet. But I didn't really know what it was. I certainly wasn't religious. I was brought up I went to an English boarding school from the age of 6, where you had to go to church every day. So religion really wasn't appealing to me. But clearly, when you look up at the night sky, there's something a great deal more than we are, of greater significance. But it took me a while to really grasp that. And it wasn't really until I was diagnosed with cancer nearly 9 years ago. And I've always been on a quest. But that really shook me up mentally. And it wasn't a very, it's a cancer which if I was lucky, I could probably get away with dying with, which is prostate cancer, but it's not a particularly good cancer. Yeah. But it's a slow one. And that and I just closed a tech company, which had cost me $1 million. And, it wasn't a particularly great 6 months.
Yeah.
You have to, as I learned, in order to open yourself up to this transformational journey, you have to let go of everything. You have to let go of your ego. You have to let go of all your attachments, all your thoughts, all the processes to everything, in order to have and accept every choice that you've made.
Yeah.
And then learn. And basically you bring yourself back to the state of nothingness, and then you can grow.
Yep. And I've been there. I've been through a recovery journey, and I remember that I've never heard anybody say it that way. I remember where I got to such a rock bottom that all the noise actually went quiet, and I was worrying about nothing. I noticed very little apart, but then eventually the next things I heard was the birds and the waves breaking against the coast. This was down in West Australia. And so I went through that point as well. That was really profound when you said that.
It is profound, and it's something which I keep with me. So if I'm in the car, I have no noise. So I might listen to a podcast, but I never turn the radio on. Rarely it will turn me. So I might listen to some mantras or some chanting or something which is spiritual and very gentle. And I prefer to be in a place of silence most of the time. A bit hard to pull off when I've got children, which I do, and a wife, but that silence to me is one of the beauties of transformational work as well, of coaching. And well, this is about leadership, but being able to get yourself into a place where your mind is silent, where you're not in this chaotic, incoherent space, but actually we're in a time of reflection.
Yeah.
That's the time we do our most brilliant work. Unless you're someone like Thomas Edison, who can actually drop themselves into a state of theta brainwave in order to come up with inventions. But that's a very deliberate strategic action you have to learn. But otherwise, this reflective stillness allows us to be intuitive. And if we don't allow that intuition in, because men in particular always believe that our value is from our head upwards and the rest of us is irrelevant. And so we use this logic brain of ours for every decision we make, every bit of strategy, but we've turned off one of the core components of being an animal, a human being, a species, which is being sentient. So that is something that I teach over and over and over again, is we have to reconnect with that sentient feeling being self, not because it's woo-woo, not because it's weak, and not because it's vulnerable, but because it is. That shows our humanity. If you don't have that, you're not really a human being anymore. You're a robot.
Absolutely. So you went through that journey, and you found this new level of awareness, self-awareness, which is critically important. And I've been through that journey, and I've been amazed. This is number 16 in the series, and the vast majority of leaders I've spoken to, just about 4 or 5 global gurus in there, to a greater or less extent, they've all been through their journey of self-awareness. So I do think there is a common thread with leaders. So then you've moved into this whole. So how did your career then develop after that period of enlightenment?
Well, the first 42 years of my career I was a barrister. Then I became a headhunter. I came to Australia 20 years ago to set up a headhunting business for myself. I did that around the world. Had a business in India, and I sold that 10 years ago. As the world was, and I was very interested in technology and building and creating, and that led into a tech company which didn't work. Just was the wrong time, and probably just the wrong idea at the wrong time. It's one of those things. What everybody wanted, what our clients wanted, but no one wanted to pay for it. That was the biggest problem. And then I started a lot of coaching and consulting to startups in the technology space, because I'd done it. I'd had a successful business. I'd sold it. I grew it to 8 figures, 7-figure profits. I'd had skin in the game. And I did a lot of startup coaching, and I've done that for a while. And I was reflecting, I think 2.5, 3 years ago, on the first thing I did is I wrote down on a piece of paper all the money that I've made in the last 20 years. And I looked at what sector was that in, compared to everything that I've done, coach, consult, mentor, billion-dollar businesses to one-to-one stuff. And all the money I'd made was really 90% of it was based on one-to-one work. But I didn't like the majority of the work that I'd done.
Your ego was pushing against it, maybe.
Well, I think it was good, clean, honest work, but I no longer felt driven to do that, or driven to do it in the same way. In the sense that I invest a lot of energy and time into everyone I work with. And if they're not on the same frequency, or their mindset is around listening but never taking any action, or not really taking your advice, I really don't see that as something which is beneficial to me or to them. So it came down to, what are the things which I'm really good at, that I enjoy still doing? And that's the one-to-one stuff. So what I do now is really a combination of personal development and professional development, some technical skills. So the transformational work that I do goes to the fundamentals of everything I've learned in business over the last 25 years, strategically, but also goes back to that spiritual quest of what is it like to be a human being. So I was working with someone earlier, who is trained just to finish their apprenticeship to be a diesel mechanic, a car mechanic. And, they're a bit of a struggle. And it suddenly came out that actually they didn't want to do this anymore. What they really wanted to do was to work with people, but they didn't know what they meant. And then we opened up the layers and revealed the background and the history and everything else. And that's a beautiful moment, when the penny drops. But then there's a process. And I was explaining that, as you and I both know, Simon, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists are there for a reason. They're professional clinicians. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm a cognitive behavioral coach, which means I work on dialogue, but I also work on the sentient basis.
Yeah.
And I was explaining to him that, there's a medical side to this transformational coaching, and then there's the cognitive side, or there's the hard-based side.
Yeah.
And there are so many different elements. So you can go and study psychology or psychotherapy or psychiatry, or you can do what I do, which is based on, coaching 15,000 people over a very long period of time. But it comes down to, what is it that you enjoy doing, that you want to continue doing, that you either want to teach someone else or learn something more about? Now, it is a very simple element. There's a complex process we go through to get to find out what that is.
Yeah.
And even now, I am withdrawing from some areas that I coach that I don't find as meaningful as the transformation work. So I still do a lot of work with founders, but I only have 2 or 3 clients, because I only work with people who are really interested in progressing themselves and their business.
Yeah.
I only do personal one-to-one coaching with a few people who really want to do that. Otherwise, I do training programs. Yeah. And I think it's still an evolutionary process, is to find what we really want to do and then how we can serve someone with that.
It's fascinating because, we connected a couple of months ago, and in that period, I've gone through a very, very similar process. Since Christmas, I've gone through a huge self process, right? And this lockdown over here, 12 weeks, I've just locked myself away, and I've reflected and reflected and reflected and self-reflected. And I've read probably about a dozen books, from, Viktor Frankl's book to Buddha's Brain to probably 15 books. And I've also then thought about my own business and where it's going and who I am and what I've done in my life, a bit like you, right? And what I really enjoy doing. And it boiled down to about 3 weeks ago, I thought, what I do is all about growth, right? And it might sound very wishy-washy, but that's what I love. I love helping leaders and organizations with, then there are 4 aspects. So it sounds a bit greedy. I love business growth, leadership growth, mindset growth, and brand growth. I love all aspects of it. And also, I have to be honest to myself, because for me, they're all very much intertwined. So this whole area of growth. And then I thought, well, a bit like you, I need to have a catchy, memorable way for people to recognize Simon Haigh. So I came up with various taglines: growth guru, growth expert, growth strategist. And then I canvassed it to about 20 people, 10 men and 10 women. And 80%, it was really enlightening. 80% came back and said, we love growth strategist. And I would never have thought that you would have had such a definitive sect landing for one term, right? And so it's all a learning process. It's all a learning process. And we were saying before that, Marshall Goldsmith talks about, setting sail, setting direction, but not being attached to the outcomes. And the most successful people do that. I think I was reading, it was in, I think the Viktor Frankl book, and he was talking about, you need to set your direction, but just let go of the outcomes, right? And you hear it, but now I'm really starting to believe that is a primary solution. And do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's one of the, in the coaching that I do, it's one of the key elements to this. And actually, in my world anyway, it comes from a Buddhist tradition, and the practice which I like most is Tibetan Buddhism, but there are plenty of them. Yeah. And this practice has come from thousands of years of coaching. It's not new to me, and it's not new to another coach. It's been passed down for generations, available to everyone. And it comes from the 3 main obstacles that human beings face, which is attachment, aversion, and ignorance, which is lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's something I had to go through. So when you go through a period of loss, whether it's financial loss, personal loss, emotional loss, or physical loss, loss of a relative or a loved one, we're grieving, and human beings grieve. But what we're grieving for is the attachment to what it was. So as a transformational coach, it could be the life someone had before something impacted them. Yeah. So they're grieving for that. But if we have less attachment to things, it is easier for us. And so one of the principles I teach is something called the 4 pillars of expectation, which is based on control, communication, knowledge, and trust. So it's measurable. Yeah. When we look at that, we look at what's the probability of a likely outcome. when you factor in those 4 pillars. And so expectation and perception are inexorably linked to two of the biggest obstacles that we as human beings face. Doesn't matter whether you're a leader.
Yeah.
And people will say, Ed, how can you coach a Fortune 100 CEO and a car mechanic?
Yeah.
What's the commonality in all of them?
Yeah.
They're human beings. They have ego. They all have feelings, and they have different strategies as to what they want to do with their lives. But ultimately, they are still generally all high-performing, high-achieving human beings that all have these similar traits that they need to unwind.
Yeah.
So I think, to me, to answer your question, Simon, it is critically important to be able to let go, and to also,
absolutely, it is.
In this Buddhist tradition, they teach the principle of equanimity, which is you let something arise so that it gets to a point where it no longer hurts you. You no longer need to pull it in or let it go. It just sits there and it just exists. Yeah. It's not easy, right? No, it takes a lot of practice.
I battled this for years. I'm in a 12-step program. I have been for nearly 15 years. And one of the key tenets of, they talk about it in recovery, is that fear of economic insecurity will leave us, right? If we really are willing, open-minded, and honest about our recovery and the wonderful things that come to us, right? That fear will leave us. And for about 14 of those 15 years, honestly, I didn't believe that, right? I didn't believe it. And then last year, I'm kind of forcing myself. Initially, I forced myself to sit back and watch life unfold. Now it's unfolding. And, you know, I was in senior executive positions for years, earning multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, as salary. And I was always fearful of losing it, terrified, fearful every day of losing what I had. Whereas today, occasionally there are moments of pangs of gut feeling, oh my God, where's the next bit of cash coming in? But today I've handed it over, and there hasn't been a month where money hasn't come in. So that fear is just, it's just a self-torment, isn't it?
It is self-torment. It's one of the easy visualization techniques to work out where this sits with you, is to imagine, and it's a very old but very well-known, somewhat cliched visualization, but it does work if you understand it, which is you imagine yourself lying in the middle of a river. Now, if you can sit in that river on your back, floating on your back, and it's carrying you and you're not fighting against it, right? And you're in the middle of that river and it's taking you where you need to go, then you're not trying to create something and fight against something which is happening to you. You're actually allowing the universe to be as it is today.
Yeah.
You're not trying to battle against it. The more you feel yourself struggling and swimming and swimming and swimming hard against it, there are times when sometimes you might need to take a few paddles quickly to extricate yourself from something. But otherwise, if you allow it to flow, that's the time when abundance is coming to you. That doesn't mean you're sitting at your desk, never having made a phone call, just waiting for something to happen. That doesn't happen.
No, of course. You've got to
put in the effort, and whether that's physical effort or whether that's an energetic effort or a combination of both, you've got to do that. But when you get to a point where, you know, a lot of athletes talk about the flow state or the peak performance state, is because you're in a place that you've created for yourself in a perfect timing that everything works together. But as soon as you try and work against this, rather like if you're walking down the street on the way to work or the way to wherever you're going, and suddenly you find everybody is closing in on you and you're trying to move left and someone moves right or someone stops in front of you, just one of those chaotic days when nothing is going. You have to have the presence to stand back and say, okay, well, this is happening. Something's going on. You know, you can look at it more deeply, but if you don't have to, I need to withdraw myself from this and just let it happen. And then when you get to where you're going, life is easier. But if you're battling every element of that, it becomes incredibly draining. And ultimately, we trip ourselves up.
And again, it's the same in 12-step programs. They talk about surrendering to recover from addiction. Right? And in early days, you think, that can't be right because I need to get a grips. But it's not. But conversely, it's not about just giving up and lying on your back and having your belly rubbed and doing nothing. That's not what surrender means. It means you've got to put the work in. It means you have to put the work in to give away your ego to allow a power greater than you to guide you. That's what it means. But nobody,
Absolutely.
either nobody tells you that in the early days, but probably more realistic, no, you're not ready to listen to that. So it's a fascinating journey. It's a fascinating journey.
And I think that's a very good point, Simon, is and someone was explaining this to me a few years ago, and I was having a conversation, and someone was really butting heads about the conversation. And this person who I didn't know very well, he said, Ed, you have to remember, not everyone's ready for the conversation.
Absolutely.
Not
Absolutely.
everyone's ready to hear your message. However passionate you are about your message, is the best thing is to stay silent. If someone wants to ask, they will.
Yeah.
But that again is a you have to learn that process. And the thing is, I say you have to learn it. We Westerners probably have to learn it more. There are people far more learned than me who never even have to work at this. They just breathe it in naturally every day. And I think that's part of letting go of the ego, as well as knowing that we do have to work hard at this, because we've created so many obstacles to unwind. But there's some people who just breathe in and out, and there it is for them.
I know, it's incredible the different types out there. So in terms of leadership, so just moving on a little bit. So what are you seeing? You know, you've written the book, or we'll get back to the book first. Author of Golden Ticket to Your Dream Job. Tell us a little bit about what that book is getting at.
The book is it's based on 20 years in the field, but I wrote the book because so many clients said, Ed, can you explain to me how I'm meant to work through the process of finding a job or working with headhunters or recruiters, whatever, because it's a very complex space. And I thought, okay, well, it's not the first book I wanted to write. That was more of a soul mission book, transformational book. But there were so many people have asked, so I wrote it, but I wrote it as a reference book, as a guide, and I've put lots of stories in there, and case studies, and the stories help them understand that this is not a technical book. It's a reference guide built with humanity. So the last chapter is called Work is Not Life. It's like, whatever you're searching for, whatever your goal is, I can teach you how to get it. That's fine.
Yeah.
But you've got to remember, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just blinkers on, head down, here we go, with no thought as to what's the destination going to look like when I get there. So one of the most powerful tools we know is visualization of what does it look like? What is it that you're searching for? What does it feel like? Who's with you? What can you touch? And so the book is a reference guide. It is technical.
Yeah.
But it's also helping people, I hope, understand that, be careful what you're searching for. Be careful what you want. Is this something that you really want? Or is this something that your brain is telling you that you need?
Or your ego.
Or your ego. Sorry, Simon.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting because I've been there. Like I strove all my life. I was a private practice lawyer, then a commercial lawyer. Then I had this bee in my bonnet that I wanted to become a CEO. And I eventually did become a CEO of an American company in Australia. And then I was asked to move on because the company was moving on, and it really hit my core hard, right? I was 45 at the time when that particular position came to an end, and I went through a bit of a second midlife crisis. And I had a mentor at the time, and he said to me, and you'll really identify with this. He said, Simon, really spend a bit of time and reflect. Why did you take that job in the first place, right? Because it was being a head of an indigenous business, working with indigenous companies in Australia. So very worthy. And he said, was it through worthiness? Was it through some altruistic, thought process? Or was there a bit of ego there? And when I really reflected, overall, it was probably ego. How cool am I getting this cool job? And I always wanted to get there. And he said, if you were attaching yourself to the ego, don't be surprised if it does come to an end, and he was right. He was right. I know that in my gut. So did you cover that kind of stuff about, because I think there's a lot of people who chase a self-imposed expectation pathway, which just isn't the right path for their soul. Do you cover that stuff?
Well, yes, that's why I developed this concept of the 4 pillars of expectation, to help them understand that as we understand, everything in life is impermanent, right? The universe is 15.2 billion years old, but it came from nothing, and eventually whatever happens will end. The nature changes every single day. Yeah. So once we understand this state of impermanence that we're in, right? Once you really grasp it, you don't have to grasp it at a deeply spiritual level. We just have to understand it logically that it exists.
Accept it.
Then accept that it exists. So yes, ego is, I mean, ego is good as well. We're our own self. Self is, there are three selves, and the one that we're talking about, which is the one which is when you're in your incoherent state, is not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course. But the first lesson in any transformational coaching is accountability.
Yeah.
Which is accepting that everything that has happened in my life is a result mainly of my choices and decisions and reactions.
Yeah.
That's ego. If you can't overcome the very first hurdle, you're not then ready for the transformational journey that you want, that you hope for and that you want, because ultimately it always comes back to, well, it's not my fault, it's someone else's fault. And if you're in that state, you're not going to open yourself up to the transformational work that needs to be done. So the very first lesson, and this is not about blame either. This is not about blaming yourself. It's not about blaming anyone else. It's just being okay.
Yeah.
That's where equanimity is, being okay with the fact that this is where it is.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And as you know, it's hard to surrender that ego to that process.
Yeah, but once you do, I tell you, it just takes so much weight off your shoulders. It really does. You sleep better at night, and you stop struggling about the things that when you used to struggle seemed so big and important. And then you realize they're really not that. I had a period when I arrived back from Australia 3.5 years ago, and I was every morning for about 9 months, I was worried that letters would come through the letterbox because I had a failed business in Australia. Every morning I worried about it, and nothing ever came. Nothing ever came. So what a waste of 9 months.
Most of our fears, I put fears into two categories, or red flags into two categories. There's the ones which are real, which will knock your head off or end your life or just, destroy your business, which you really need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And there are the ones which are really tend to be past events or something which we predict may happen or anticipate may happen. And it's amazing how many people trip themselves up every day based on an event which hasn't happened for a long time.
Exactly.
Maybe happened in their childhood, maybe happened 5 years ago, or maybe wasn't as big as they thought it was, but to them it's this huge event, and if I keep on this path, it's going to happen again. And it's not reality.
Yeah, it's not
reality in its perception, but ultimately they haven't happened. And the more we work with people to understand all these things which they predict and anticipate and plan for, which is the fear, which is the reason they don't do things, that they haven't happened and they're not hurting them, then we can move through that to understand that what they're looking to confront may be painful, but actually isn't hurting them in any other capacity. In other words, it's not hurting them tangibly. It's preventing them, but it's obviously not causing damage.
So, this conversation's flown by, and I don't have time for half of the questions I was thinking about, but you sum it up perfectly, because I've been through this journey you've spoken about over the last 2 to 3 years, and you have a really good way of summarizing these points. And I know that. I'm not just saying that because I know this subject, right? And you summarize it really well. And so just to conclude, if you were going to whisper 2 or 3 words of helpful, soothing advice or wisdom to a future leader, right, of any industry, to really set them up for as much success as they can get within the realms of reality, what 2 or 3 things would you love, through the prism of love, to whisper to them?
Well, the first one is speak less and listen more. And the second one would be kind to yourself first and then to others. And if you abide by those 2 simple principles, now there are others, which is always ask questions of the questions. Never assume that anything you're told is right or wrong. Always have that startup mentality of test, iterate, learn, test, iterate, learn, constantly go through that process. Yeah. But if you're listening and not talking, if you're having a conversation, not a dialogue, if your principle is to be kind to other people, I think it sets the stage for whatever success you can create. There's no guarantee, there's no crystal ball that your idea is going to pay off. There's no guarantee. Even Jeff Bezos says, we're already planning for Amazon no longer to be here anymore. Yeah. And he's nearly worth $1 trillion because he knows it will end one day.
Everything moves on.
Everything moves on. But the principle, if you look after your people, if you're kind to them and you listen to them and you're prepared, and my father taught me this lesson, Not technically, but just from watching him, which is, I remember he would go into a shop or he'd talk to someone who came to the property to, mend a fence or deliver something or whatever it was. And he would speak to them with as much kindness and probably spend longer talking to them than he would, and he was a CEO and chairman of a bank, than he would to everyone else. But he had that simple quality of being kind to everyone. In fact, even being even more kind to the people who most other people don't pay attention to. And I think if you have that quality as a leader, and you have an open heart as a leader, leaders need to, I say this often, leaders need to think less and feel more.
Yeah. I think we'll end on that. That's perfect. So Ed, how do people connect with you or find out more about your work?
Very simply, best way of finding me is edandrew.com, and you can find my podcast, Human Impact with Ed Andrew, on Apple Podcast or Spotify, your favorite podcast channel. LinkedIn, and it's probably the place you'll find me most on social media, though. So I have a community on Facebook and Instagram as well. So wherever you prefer to hang out, I would be very happy to talk to you.
That's great. It's been wonderful talking to you. It's been quite a profound conversation for me. And as I said, you have a real good skill of articulating the key point in a solid, no nonsense, steady and soothing way. So people should just definitely check out your work. Thanks, Ed.
My pleasure, Simon. Thank you so much. And thank you for letting me in to be part of your journey as well. That's very kind of you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.